Okay, so good evening to all. Good evening, sir. I'm Priya, Faculty Department of History, Providence Women's College. Very warm welcome to the international webinar organized by the Department of History, Providence College. And we have in our midst one of the brightest scholars and surely a joy of history, Professor Dilip Menon, who is a Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. And sir, we actually wanted to gift this webinar as a gift to our students, that is on August 15th, because we know that freedom is, we are all actually trying to break a bondage from one kind of the other. It could be familial, it could be gender-related issues, it could be poverty-related. And freedom, I have to say, is more or less, I have to say that freedom is a kind of self-luminous existence, which would help the individual fix his or her identity without being forced and compelled to join a predetermined category. So I firmly believe that freedom is a kind of a perspective, and having a perspective is freedom. So this was actually a gift that we wanted to give us students on Independence Day, and because they're so excited that you are joining us from South Africa, a place from where Gandhiji had launched his satyagraha, a lot of its experiments, satyagraha experiments. And sir, he's today going to speak on the topic Affinity to World, Rethinking Nationalism through the Swadeshi Movement. And he has also written extensively on caste, nationalism, and communism, and all of us know regarding that. Now, for those people who do not know about Providence College, let me tell you, this is in fact a college run by the Sisters of Apostolic Carmel Congregation, established in the year 1952. And we impart holistic education to our students, and we focus on equity and inclusivity, which was envisaged by our foundress, Mother Veronica. Then regarding Sir Dilip Menon, sir, I have to say that, sir, actually, I was clueless when Dr. Laina gave me the email ID as to find out whether you would be available for a webinar, because I have so many experiences where people have snubbed me, people have given negative replies on my face, but this was such a prompt reply from your side, and it appeared like something surreal to me, and I should really thank you for that, because that is, I think, what that sort of a courtesy is what we are lacking in general now. So from a scholar of your stature, that is something, what are they, out of what I say, I have to really thank you for that. And also, I think it is this quality which makes you, one in a thousand, or perhaps totally class apart. Okay, I would like to, it's my pleasure to call you a historian, happier to call you an intellectual, happiest to call you a historian who is a down-to-earth intellectual, sir. So very happy that you agreed to, participate in our seminar and to be our resource person. Then regarding, we have a diverse audience now, and the fraternity in history knows very well about his intellectual acumen as well as his credentials. But I should say that as we have a diverse audience, a lot of people from NCC, National Cadet Corps, and some other disciplines too. We have our secretary, Arthana George, and she'll be introducing our resource person to all of you. Arthana George is a very smart child, and she has dance and art as her forte. And we have to, I think, because this is a time when the coronavirus is still not left us and we've transcended to the virtual, teachers are dominating because we are conducting seminars, we reign supreme, and students are kind of sidelined always. Some of them are not even in the picture due to connectivity issues. Some are there and who are intimidated, muted as spectators. So I think we should give them a chance, sir. So I invite Arthana to introduce this, sir, to all of you. Arthana, could you please unmute and speak?
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, sir, and good evening to all of you.
Good evening. How are you?
Fine. I am Arthana K. George, Association Secretary of History Department, and I'm happy to introduce our speaker to all of you. Professor Dilip Menon, sir, is the Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand. He was educated at the universities of Delhi, Oxford, and Cambridge, and got his PhD degree from Cambridge. He is a translator from Malayalam and writes on film, theatre, and literature. His research for the past decade has engaged with issues of caste, socialism, and equality in modern India. And he has also worked on issues of culture, cultural, and intellectual history. For the past decade, he has been engaged with thinking and writing on histories of the Indian Ocean and knowledge from the global south. His recent publications include the edited volumes Capitalism Towards a Global History and Concepts from the Global South. He has recently called for thinking history with water in an essay in the inaugural issue this year of the journal Global Perspectives, titled Walking on Water, Globalization and History. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So, may I now commence?
Yeah. Can we start, sir, then?
Yeah, I can start now.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Priya, thank you, Artana, thank you, Lina, and the Providence College for inviting me to speak. My apologies for not being able to speak to all of you earlier. Priya had requested that I speak closer to Independence Day. We're only 2 days on this side instead of 2 days prior. And I thought I would speak to some of the issues that arise out of our having now or nearing 75 years of Indian independence, and some of the problems that India faces as a country, and how do we think about being nationalist without being chauvinist, where increasingly that is the tendency that is becoming evident in the Indian political and the public sphere. And we're very conscious that as we approach 75 years of independence, we're very conscious of three things. The first is that the Indian National Congress Party, which had led India to independence and was associated with figures like Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, Bose, and so on, is now in decline and directionless. So what we are faced with is a political situation in India where we have one party which dominates the national political scene, and there doesn't seem to be a viable opposition party. The Indian National Congress, which had been the majority party and the main party in the political sphere, is now seemingly falling apart at the seams, and it doesn't have a sense of leadership or a sense of direction. And this is something that demands that we pay attention to if we are to think about the continuance of democratic traditions, because after all, we need a viable opposition for any government to function. The second is that India is increasingly being divided along the lines of religion, and we seem to be moving from a secular nation to a Hindu republic. And this is becoming more and more evident in the actions of the present day government. And the third is been a persistent feature of Indian life or Indian political and social life, that caste inequality and caste violence are still a feature, an everyday feature of Indian daily life, which leads us to wonder what 75 years of democracy have done for ensuring the equality, liberty, and fraternity, which are written into our constitution. And so it's worthwhile recalling the words of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, where one of the things that he pointed out was that it would be extremely difficult to bring about democratic ideals on what he saw as the undemocratic soil of India. It's a society characterized by equality and liberty, or could aspire for equality and liberty through legislation, but it's certainly you cannot impose or legislate fraternity into existence, that the existence of caste created too many divisions between human beings within Indian society. So what he said was that Indian society is characterized by an ascending hierarchy of reverence and a descending hierarchy of contempt. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, sir. Very much, very much. Yeah.
Yeah, because the screen keeps shifting, so I'm not sure exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
So an ascending hierarchy of reverence and a descending hierarchy of contempt. And one of the things that he pointed out again is a phrase that's very resonant for our times, that what we have with the kinds of restrictions that are placed between interactions between individuals, and that we have the strange opposition that's created in the Indian mind between something called love marriage and arranged marriage, that arranged marriages usually involve people marrying within their community, within their caste. Ambedkar said that there is a deep biological trench that runs through Indian society. Right? One can't think of a more plangent phrase to describe Indian society, that we are divided into these little communities through which these biological trenches run. And the kind of division that we see is something that we need to take into account when we think about any notion of democracy or of independence or of the future political prospects of India. And this became very evident at the beginning of the year, the most fundamental question of citizenship, with the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the huge opposition to it across the board, people of various political stripes, across gender, across religion. And it was largely perceived that the Citizenship Amendment Act was making some citizens more equal than the others. And one of the most significant sources of opposition to this did come in when we looked at what happened at Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, which became a metaphor for Indian democracy, where a nation was brought together by its women, right? Where large numbers of women gathered in Shaheen Bagh, and this was replicated in large parts of India, in different places in India, where the idea that democracy was not something that would be given to us and would sustain itself, that we have to fight for it. So in that sense, Shaheen Bagh reminded us that Indian democracy is still in the making, has still to be fought for, and there are many more goals that remain unachieved. And what it also reminded us was of a fact that the long shadow of the partition lay across India's history, because the creation of India and Pakistan were based on borders, based on religion, right? While India called itself a secular country, and Pakistan initially began as a secular country, but has increasingly become an Islamic state. And I mean, India's future still remains indeterminate if you think about it. The political philosopher Noeman Andruth has said, wherever the Muslim is the border with Pakistan. That is the kind of situation we live in, where the idea of religious borders has created a notion of a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan. And this is the shadow that is cast to Indian democracy that we need to think about. And this is hugely ironical when you consider what the civil and political activist Harsh Mandar says, where he says that the Muslim is the only person who chose to be a citizen of India. Right? All of us are citizens by default. I mean, all of us, meaning Hindus and Christians, we weren't asked to make a choice at the time of India's independence as to where we wanted to be. We were where we were. The Muslims were asked to choose, do you want to be here or there? And right now we are in a situation where it is the people who have chosen to be citizens of India who are seen with the greatest suspicion by a ruling political party. And the second thing that has happened is also the fact that because of the borders that were created through the mass migrations of people during partition, and as you know, this was one of the greatest migrations in human history, mass migrations in human history, it also unnaturalized the idea of the migrant, where the idea of refugee, the idea of the migrant became something that's a suspect category. And this is something that underlies the Citizenship Amendment Act as well. And it's interesting to remember that India has not ratified the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, nor the 1967 Protocol. So the idea of the citizen as being like a mushroom, somebody who grows spontaneously from within, where if you think about the history of India is made up of the movement of people, right? Even if you think about Malayalis are everywhere, all over India. And some argued in 1969, even on the moon, right? So it's just a nation that is made up through a constant movement of people now is trying to fossilize it and to create an idea of a citizen by distinguishing the citizen from the refugee, from the migrant, and so on and so forth. And very often these are premised on religious lines. And as Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, put it very clearly, the right to have rights should be guaranteed by humanity itself. That the very fact of being a human should guarantee you a home, rather than these identities which are very contingent, like citizenship, the formation of nation states, and so on. So those are general remarks with which because we always think from within a crisis. As historians, it's impossible. It is important to remember that history is not a flow from the dinosaur to yesterday, right? A ceaseless flow of time. That we always speak from within a crisis, and the crisis that India's democracy faces right now also should condition the questions that we ask as historians. So let's take a step back from the present closing of the Indian mind, and this is something that we are seeing increasingly, and this is the threat that faces us as a democracy, where we are imagining ourselves in very narrow chauvinistic terms as a nation. When we have phrases like Mera Bharat Mahan and so on, there is a forgetfulness of India as belonging to a larger committee of nations, right? That we are a nation among other nations, and there are these flows of people across these spaces that we need to take into account. So you take Gandhi himself, and Priya mentioned this very early on in her introduction, that Gandhi finds himself to be an Indian in his time spent in South Africa. Because when he leaves India to go to South Africa as a young lawyer, he goes as a Gujarati. And once he's in South Africa, he discovers himself as an Indian, fighting for the rights of Indians within that space. And by the time he comes back to India, he's committed to the idea of an India which he has imagined and fought for elsewhere across the ocean. Think again about someone like Nehru, who through the period from around the early decades of the 20th century till the 1930s, Nehru was a part of various international movements like the League Against Imperialism, where he was joining with other political forces, political revolutionaries from across the globe, and with other nations fighting against colonialism. So that when India becomes independent in 1947, one of the most important events that happens in the mid-20th century is the Bandung Conference of 1955, where all the leaders of newly independent Asian and African nations come together. Right? The idea is that we have all fought for freedom together against empire, and that we're all joined. Our histories are joined. We can't imagine ourselves separately as Kenya, as Tanzania, as Indonesia, as India, that there is a common history that was being invoked. And this continued into notions like the non-aligned movement, political formations like the non-aligned movement, the idea of third world solidarity, all of which seem like a distant dream right now. Right? When we stand at the present moment, these seems like moments from the past. But it's important to think about an imagination of nationalism which happened in a space of connections between nations, historical connections between nations, political connections between nations. And so this is important to remember from our present moment, where we have a very narrow definition of nationalism, which is moving towards increasingly a religious chauvinism. So in that sense, so when we look back from this moment, when we look back from 2020, right, one moment we could look back to is 1947, the history of the independence. It's also the history of partition and the creation of two nations, of Pakistan and India. 71, Bangladesh is created. These various secessions from the idea of India that we began with in the early 20th century. And it's important then to think back to moments where there were other visions that were possible, other visions that were generated, which is why I thought we'd speak about the Swadeshi movement, which all of you are familiar with. And the word Swadeshi is acquiring a completely different connotation right now, as you know, right? Where the idea of make in India, of the idea that India is a country all by itself, that India is a country that needs to be proud of a tradition that is wholly contained within a 2,000 to 5,000 year history on the subcontinent. It's almost as if there have been no connections with the world in that period. And the fact that the world has always been present and India has always been part of the world is something that's being increasingly forgotten. So even when you think about the Swadeshi movement, it was a short-lived movement, as those of you who studied history know it. And usually the dates that are given to the Swadeshi movement are 1905 to 1908, because history is all about dates, and the 20th century begins in 1900 and so on, right? And all of these are heuristic devices. These are explanatory devices, and we need to be slightly more imaginative. Now, the reason why the Swadeshi movement is studied is that it marks, in the history of nationalism, it marks the emergence of a militant nationalism, right? The idea of revolutionary terrorism, and we still continue to use this phrase, which is actually a colonial description of indigenous political activity, of revolutionary terrorists, right? It's quite interesting how the overlays of an earlier historiography continue even into a nationalist historiography. So the question is, how do we think back to that world, which is actually a world historical movement? So the Swadeshi movement is happening at a time where there are similar political movements happening all over the world. There is a paradigm of thinking that has emerged in the world, of which the Swadeshi movement is a symptom, right? And it's part of that. But we tend to absorb it when we study it as merely a history of the nationalist movement. So between the moderates and the extremists and the emergence of Gandhi, there is that brief failure of the Swadeshi movement, right? When India embarks on militant nationalism, then you have Gandhian non-violence. And of course, Swadeshi doesn't fit into that narrative, because we tend to assume that the Indian nationalist movement was fought entirely through non-violent methods, which is not true. And very often that non-violence was and probably a epistemic violence, so to speak. So when you think about the fact that the Indian nationalist movement was non-violent, it was non-violent in its the way in which it managed to create a field of politics which excluded Muslims, which excluded untouchables, which excluded multiple divisions that existed within Indian society. And those are the legacies that we live with right now, right? The consequences of that setting aside. What is interesting is that when you think about the early 20th century, at the time 1905 to 1908 is when the Swadeshi movement happened. So what else is happening in the world at that point, right? And this is an important question to ask. So if you think about China, right? In 1911, you have the Chinese Revolution with Sun Yat-sen. But prior to that, the Chinese nationalists in the late 19th century are thinking about the world not only, or thinking about Chinese nationalism not only with China alone. They're thinking, one, with the resistance of Philippines to American imperialism. America is trying to take over the Spanish colony of Philippines from in the late 19th century, 1895. There is huge Filipino resistance. So that becomes a model of nationalism for the Chinese. Secondly, the Boer War is happening in South Africa, where the Boers are resisting British Empire. The third is a very interesting historical phenomenon where Chinese nationalists are also going back a few centuries to the partition of Poland in the 18th century, when the idea of nationhood emerges, right? The idea of nationhood having to be created and defended. So the Chinese nationalists create and imagine their nationalism within a very large geography, which includes South Africa, which includes Philippines, which includes Poland. The Swadeshi movement itself is very influenced in its methods and in its political philosophy by the Narodnik movement in Russia, where the people's movement is fighting against the autocracy of the Tsar, and the repression of the Tsar generates a revolutionary terrorism. There are these little cells that come up of revolutionaries. There is the assassination of one of the Tsars, so on and so forth. So you have to imagine the Swadeshi movement is happening amidst a whole set of events in the world on which it is drawing upon. So it's like a library of categories and techniques that everyone is drawing upon across the world. And in 1905, even as Bengal is being partitioned, one of the most significant events of the 20th century happens, which is the war between Japan and Russia. And Japan defeats Russia. Now, this is a startling event because it's the first time an Asian power has defeated a European power. Remember, the world has been colonized by Europe at that point, and the idea of European technological superiority, military superiority, superiority of scientific knowledge, all of that is being naturalized, and then Japan defeats Russia. And this creates huge shockwaves among people who have been colonized. And the very idea that the partition of Bengal represents an act of arbitrary power becomes possible because of the Japanese defeat of the Russians, and also to imagine that it is possible for Asians to rise up, right, in revolt, rise up to protest against the political control of empire. So a new geography is emerging, and this is important to remember, that there is a new geography of political affinity that is emerging, where Chinese are imagining an affinity with Filipinos and South Africans, with the Polish. India is looking to Japan. Even in Ottoman Turkey, a large number of intellectuals are now beginning to learn Japanese, because Japan is emerging as this possible source of resistance to European imperialism. And this new geography creates a parallel map. So you have the pink map of empire, right, which is slowly spreading its stain across the globe. And a parallel map of freedom comes to be imagined from 1905 onwards, where the connections are larger than the British Empire. So even though you might be subject to the British Empire, you're thinking about political activities that are happening outside it. So there's a whole new map emerging, which stretches from Mexico to Singapore, from Berlin to the Philippines, and from Paris to Johannesburg. Remember, Gandhi is writing Hind Swaraj shortly after this, right? In 1905 is the Swadeshi Movement, and it's around that period that Gandhi is writing Hind Swaraj as well. So suddenly the history of the Swadeshi Movement becomes less a small event in the history of Indian nationalism and connected to these world historical events, and in some sense reminding us that every nation is only a nation among other nations. And that geography, when we talk about territory, we tend to imagine India as extending from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from the northeastern states to Gujarat. But there is also a territory of the imagination, right? And that is what is being summoned up, where the people in the Ottoman Empire begin to see an affinity with people in Japan. People in India begin to see an affinity with the revolutionaries in Russia, and so on. So there's an explosion of imaginations that happens at the beginning of the 20th century. And this movement of people and ideas, and the world is in a churn at that point. And it's very interesting to think about it, that we are all used to the fact of passports, right? When you say, I am an Indian citizen, very often it means carrying an Indian passport. But it is precisely at this moment that the idea of the connectedness of the world is being established, that the historian John Torpy argues that this is the point at which passports come into existence, as states and empires are terrified at the prospect of this movement of people and the connection that are being built up against authoritarian imaginations. So the passport is invented in the middle of these connections, new connections that are being forged. So how do we think this politics of affinity, right, rather than the narrow politics of nationalism? How do we think about a politics of affinity which triumphs over narrow territorial identities? That to be an Indian does not only mean you hold an Indian passport or you support the Indian cricket team and various other, how shall I put it, etiolated notions of identity. That to be an Indian also is to be committed to a larger principle, such as Ambedkar said, a principle of equality, liberty, and fraternity. And what that means is that you imagine as an Indian other spaces in the world where people are engaged in similar fights, asserting the value of humanity, which means that to be an Indian is to think with the world, not to think with India alone. Remember the phrase from Tagore, right, in Gitanjali, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. Right? That is nationalism. Nationalism is not about thinking about your country, but you have to think about the world and create a politics of affinity, aspirations towards equality, aspirations towards freedom, and so on. Chris Manjapra, a historian whose recent work on looking at Indians who engaged in these transnational enterprises of politics. His recent work on territorial politics argues that alongside the territorial politics of the Indian nation state, we should think about a deterritorial politics. So you have the territorial politics of Indian nationalism, should think about a deterritorial politics which imagines a transnational solidarity, right? Where Indians are imagining affinities with people, like-minded people, a like-minded politics that exists everywhere. The fight for equality, that is what unites us as human beings. The fight to be compassionate, that's what unites us as human beings. It's not an affinity to a plot of land or earth, right? It's a larger imagination that we need to summon up. So think about some examples here. Jyotiba Phule, the Maharashtrian reformer, right, a predecessor to Ambedkar in thinking about the idea of equality, he writes a book in 1873 called Gulamgiri, or Slavery. And what does he do in this book? He compares the experience of Indian untouchables with slaves in America, and he dedicates the book in 1873 to the Negroes, which is how they were known, the Negroes of America who have fought for and gained freedom. So suddenly, Jyotiba Phule, writing in Maharashtra in the late 19th century, makes a leap across the ocean to another space, right, where a certain dream has been realized, right? And he's not being not nationalist. He's thinking with the larger politics of compassion and equality. So Jyotiba Phule, writing in 1873, dedicates Gulamgiri to the former slaves in the US. Think about Nehru's discovery of India, which we always study as a nationalist text, which imagines an India that has a historical continuity from the Indus Valley civilization to the present. But alongside this book, he also writes glimpses of world history, right? This is what people often forget, that there is a trilogy that Nehru is writing. He writes his autobiography, he writes a discovery of India, and he writes glimpses of world history, where he puts Indian civilization alongside other civilizations, the Roman, the Greek, and so on and so forth. He's thinking about a large map. Think again with somebody like Wakam Muhammad Maulavi, right? When he thinks about Kerala, he's also putting Kerala in a map of Indian Ocean Islam, stretching all the way from Southeast Asia to Cairo. And he's also concerned with this whole history of the flow of people from the Hadramaut region, the fact that people from the southwestern coast of India go to be educated in Al-Azhar in Cairo. So again, the idea of a larger politics of affinity becomes evident. And finally, to give you an example, which is a very piquant example, when you think about someone who is generally seen as a Nair social reformer, Mannatha Padmanabhan Nair, right? So what does Mannatha Padmanabhan Nair do on his Shashti Bhurti? It's very interesting what he does. He gets together his friends, they all dress in their munda and veshti and so on, sit around a lamp. They light a lamp, they sit around the lamp, and they read a book together. What is the book that they read? It's not Editachan's Ramayanam, it's not the Bhagavad Gita, it's not the rules of the Nair Service Society. They read Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery. Yeah? This is similar gesture to what Jyotiba Phule did in 1873. Now, why does Mannatha Padmanabhan, whom we see as his conservative Murachi Nair leader, why is he looking across to a history of the US? Because suddenly in that moment, he realizes that Booker T. Washington, a former slave, speaks to a spirit of equality, a spirit of hope, a spirit of advancement. So these are the histories that we need to think about. And if you're writing the history of Kerala and you're writing only about Kerala, it's not a history worth writing, right? The history of Kerala, or indeed the history of India, is located in these multiple histories that we have to think about. And there is very interesting work which is being done by a younger generation of Malayalis. So those of you who are interested in this, I mean, particularly Wakam Muhammad Maulavi and the Indian Ocean Islam, we have Mahmood Kuria, who is from Kozhikode, who's now teaching at the University of Leiden, and Ashoka, who's writing extensively on Indian Ocean Islam and these connections. Sumit Sarkar, when he writes his classic monograph on the Swadeshi movement, he argues that when you look at the Swadeshi movement, we must move it out of its narrow territorial placement. The Swadeshi movement is not just something that happens in Bengal, right, or Punjab or Maharashtra. He says that the revolutionary abroad, because what happens after the Swadeshi movement is equally important. So the revolutionary abroad, the diaspora of Swadeshi, ended the parochialism of the Indian nationalist movement. And this is a question that I'm going on to speak about. So what happens after 1908? Did the Swadeshi movement end in 1908 and then we forget about it and then we move on to other topics which have to be taught in the syllabus? Or do we think about the Swadeshi movement as having defined a certain world historical moment? It's important to remember that it's at the same time as the Swadeshi movement that ideas like pan-Islamism, which were to find political expression in the Khilafat movement later, pan-Asianism, which draws people from China and Japan to come to Shantiniketan, for example, and spend time with Tagore, with his large universal imagination of history and of space and of politics. And what the Bengali sociologist, contemporary sociologist, Binoy Kumar Sarkar called Vishwa Shakti, right, a world force. That at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a Vishwa Shakti or a world force that was being invoked. And what was happening with the Swadeshi diaspora? So once the Swadeshi movement is over, the British colonial government imposes restrictions, right? Legal restrictions, political restrictions, free speech is removed, huge censorship, very reminiscent of what is happening in contemporary India right now, where a large number of our prominent intellectuals have been put away in prison for dissent, right? You think about Professor Sai Baba, you could think about Gautam Naulakha, you could think about large numbers of people who have been put away in prison. Professor Hani Babu, my former colleague from Delhi University, has recently been arrested. So we are looking at a situation where the colonial government is cracking down and large numbers of dissident political activists then begin to leave India. And they disperse all over the world to places like London, New York, Tokyo, California, Berlin, Mexico. And it's important to remember this history, that these were the sites also of Indian political activity. There were Indian political activists who were meeting the Irish, meeting Chinese, meeting Caribbean activists, African activists, and all of them in these international spaces were reimagining a nationalism, right? A nationalism that was based on connections that were premised not only on national pride, but on affinity, about imagining equality, imagining new forms of political freedom together. And these intellectuals create a common discourse that question the hegemony of Europe, hegemony of colonialism. So, for example, Shyamji Krishnavarma, who is a scholar, Gujarati scholar of Sanskrit, who teaches at Oxford, who is a sociologist, spends his last years in Switzerland. He sets up India House in London, which becomes a refuge for all these diasporic political dissidents. And this is where Gandhi and Savarkar meet for the first time. It's a very unique meeting. We don't have much of a record of what exactly the conversations were, but this is the kind of meeting that became possible, which was not possible in India. Right? So Mahatma Gandhi and Savarkar in conversation, all of us as historians would die to have been present on that occasion, right? Thinking about what that conversation might have entailed. So when Shyamji Krishnavarma founds India House in London, this is a place that brings together Irish revolutionaries, it brings together people like Gandhi and Savarkar, it brings together a whole host of people who are imagining their own nations while they are abroad. Forging a nation in the smithy of their soul, as James Joyce might have put it. Think again about another individual, M.N. Roy, right? Swadeshi activist, Bengali intellectual, who, because of colonial censorship and colonial surveillance, he's forced to leave India, moves to Mexico. He founds the Communist Party of Mexico. So the Communist Party of Mexico is not founded by a Mexican, it's founded by a Bengali, right, who has left India after the Swadeshi movement. And from there, M.N. Roy then begins to engage in a debate with Lenin about the role of the bourgeoisie in nationalist revolutions. He then moves to Germany, becomes a member of the Frankfurt School and reports on counter-revolution and counter-revolution in China, right? So you're thinking about this flow of people, a flow of people in search of like-minded people, right, who are all pursuing the same ideal. And you have similar figures like M.N. Roy, you have Rash Bihari Bose in Japan, you have the emergence in the US, in the United States, in San Francisco, of what is called the Gadar movement, right? The founding of in 1913 of this newspaper called Gadar or Revolution, which brings together the Bengali diaspora from the Swadeshi and Punjabi agricultural labor. So starting from the late 19th century, large numbers of Punjabi peasants have been moving across the ocean to work in the farms of California, and the Bengali exiles and the Punjabi labor come together to forge a new movement to fight against imperialism. And Maya Ramnath's new work on international anarchism looks at how the Bengali intellectuals and Punjabi laborers came together with international anarchists, right, who were in the US. And what you have here is a history of Indian nationalism that reminds you that Indian nationalism was not only made within India. Right? No political movement can be imagined in isolation, within a limited territorial space. All emancipation, all thoughts about freedom have to encompass the globe, because the equality of one person is the equality of all. Right? And you have to imagine these affinities in order to imagine a new future and a new world. But even as we talk about all of this, it's important to remember that there are limits. Right? And these are the important limits that we need to think about, even as we imagine these connections that are being made across the globe between very unlikely people who now we think of as belonging to different nationalities. So, for example, if you think about Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, Gandhi writes the Hind Swaraj in the first decade of the 20th century, and he is in South Africa at that point for 20 years. And in his writings, he is conflicted by the idea of any affinity with Black people. Right? He sees himself as an Indian. He invents himself as an Indian, imagines himself as an Indian in South Africa. But that politics of becoming Indian does not allow him to engage in an active empathy with the local Black population. So if you were to read Gandhi's writings of the late 19th century, the last decade of the 19th century, his remarks about Black Africans are very disparaging. He does not enter, and it's important to remember why this is so. Because if you think about Hind Swaraj, the text that he writes, which is about India, the one figure that is missing in the Hind Swaraj is the untouchable. Right? Because remember, Gandhi came from a very patrician family. He comes from a family of princely advisors in Gujarat. India is structured by the idea of caste and hierarchy. So Hind Swaraj has no place for the untouchable. When he goes to South Africa, he can't even imagine this affinity between Indian and African. He sees the Africans as uncivilized, as barbaric, and so on. His views change over a period of time, but at the point that he's in South Africa, there is a limit to the affinity that he can have. So when we think about that leap of imagination that happened on the coast of San Francisco between the Bengali elite and the Punjabi laborer, right, where there was this movement across class, a similar movement across race does not become possible for Gandhi, also because of the deep biological trench that runs through Indian society, which I pointed out earlier, Ambedkar's phrase. So if you think about the present as well, there is a very uncertain relation of Indian nationalism to its labor diaspora. We are very eager to claim Kamala Harris as an Indian. How eager are we to claim the laborer in Dubai as an Indian? Right? So there are these divisions where our politics of affinity is sometimes undercut by the hierarchies that exist in India, which create these various distinctions of religion, of class, of caste, and so on. So even when you make films on the non-resident Indian is usually a very wealthy upper caste or upper class Indian. It's not about labor. Malayalam film has slowly moved towards engaging with films like Gaddama, for example. Right? I mean, we know Kerala is a different space, so I shan't go there. Otherwise, I'll start sounding like a Malayali chauvinist. Kerala is a different space in the way it imagines these issues. So this question of the uncertain relationship of nationalism to its labor diaspora, and interestingly enough, and this is something that I've written about, the larger forgetfulness of the fact that of the maritime imagination, right? India is imagined as this landlocked entity. There is that entire half of India that's open to the Indian Ocean. And the ocean has always represented the space of freedom, people moving across the ocean to other parts of the globe, ideas coming in. Why are there the first Muslims, the first Jewish people, the first Christians in Kerala? It's because of the ocean. Right? But when we write histories of Kerala, it's always a history of the land. So land relations, about Janmis and Kanakas and Patakas and so on. And that whole history of the ocean is excised, it's cut off. We might as well be Hungary, for that matter, in terms of having no water around us. So I'll come to the final point and I'll end because we're coming up to around 45 minutes. And I shouldn't go on any longer because I will stand between you and dinner and sleep and various other things that you might want to do in the evening. So if you think about Hindu nationalism right now, as represented by the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the way it imagines the world as a Hindu internationalism. It's a connecting up with other Hindus elsewhere. Right? And here again, this question is important because the question of relating to a class of Indians who are upper class and upper caste is crucial in this. Because if you think about the affinities that are being generated by Hindu nationalism with the international Hindu, Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, the sites of former Indian labor, former Indian indentured labor are lower down in the hierarchy than a place like the US, the space of the professional Indian coming from the upper caste and so on and so forth. So this delight of a Kamala Harris as a vice presidential candidate for Joe Biden, if you go by sections of what is being represented in a social media, it matters more for the Indian social media that she's Brahmin rather than black. Right? And this is the problem that we have to contend with. So to end with a final point, if you go back to what Ambedkar said about the nature of Indian society, an ascending hierarchy of reverence and a descending hierarchy of contempt, the deep biological trench that runs through Indian society, separating Indian from Indian and so on, while there is a performance, a cosmopolitan performance in India of an affinity with things, with issues like Black Lives Matter. It's interesting to think that Dalit Lives Matter has not become a slogan in India. From 1947 to the present, every day, any historian who reads the newspapers knows that there are killings of Dalits, the burning of Dalit villages. There is a whole list of atrocities against Dalits that one could draw on from 1947 to the present, but as yet we do not have a movement which says Dalit Lives Matter. We are willing to make that, or our upper classes and our cosmopolitan classes are willing to make the leap across the ocean to say Black Lives Matter, but not considering events that happen at home. So a true internationalism and a true nationalism can emerge only when we recognize that we need to create these affinities within emerging maps of freedom. And that compassion is something that encompasses the human. Compassion cannot be divided between religions and classes and castes and so on. Compassion is a fundamental human reaching out to another human as a human. And in that sense, when we think about India's nationalism, we think about India as a nation, and we think about the next 25 years, 50 years, 75 years, this is the question that we have to ask ourselves. Right? You think about that old slogan of the Unni Nambudiri movement, Nambudiriye Manushinaka. The question that we have to ask is, Indians-ine engane manushyarakkunnathu? That is the fundamental question for us in a society that seems to be hugely divided by religion and caste and so on. And one of the reasons why we are forced to think about this also is because of COVID-19. Because COVID-19 and the virus has reminded us that it doesn't matter who we are. It doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter what our nationality is. In the end, we are all mortals and we will die, right? And you think about the last words, and this is what I'd like to leave you with. The last words of George Floyd, right? As the policeman knelt on his neck and two other policemen held him down and he said, I want to breathe. That is the fundamental human aspiration for every human, to breathe free and to live as a human being, live with the notion of fraternity, live with the notion of equality, and to live with the notion that we are connected to all other people who are human, and that we live in a world in which equality is not realized. We live in a world in which we are divided rather than brought together. So thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Okay, sir. Thanks a lot. That was a very interesting session. And you have, in fact, given a very comprehensive view of what nationalism is and also what we should do in India, because we are so divided now, as you told correctly. I have a question, sir, but at the end, I'll be asking it because I'm sure so many other people will have questions here to ask you. And I'm so glad that Godwin, sir, Principal Christian College is here, and a lot of other teachers from other colleges, not only history, other disciplines are also here. From our own college, we have teachers from zoology, teachers from English, and also a large number of students from various disciplines and other colleges. From MMO College, we have from Zamorin's College, Government Arts and Science College. So if you have any questions, please be free to ask. You can unmute yourself and speak. Godwin, sir?
Yeah, there aren't any questions appearing on the chat box. I was just looking at the chat box here.
Yeah, Unimaya has a question. Unimaya is a student
Hi, Godwin. How are you? How are you?
Sir, good evening. Yeah, fine. Sir, anyhow, very interesting talk. It's highly relevant for the present day condition. So India and the world was also facing a lot of problems of this type of, I think the dividism or the colonial masters followed earlier. So the same way followed our people in our country to divide people, and also using this opportunity, especially in the COVID-19 situation, they were enforcing their agenda for dividing our people and to create communal tensions, all these things. So you clearly mentioned that everything in a very short period, very short time. I have no question. Anyhow, I appreciate, sir, you coming over here and interact with the academic community, especially the Kerala people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nimaya, you have a question, right? Nimaya?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Hi,
sir. It's a pleasure meeting you, and your session was very informative, as everyone said. So my question is, I recently came across this place called Rojava. They incorporate this anarchist type of regime, and it's kind of very beautiful the way they administer their state. So how do you think that will work in India? Will that work in India if everyone strive towards it?
No, it's like, see, when you think about now, when you talk about Rojava, as we know, it's Abdullah Öcalan's idea of confederalism, right? And we're talking about a small space which is under attack by a whole range of other powers, whether it's Iraqi or whether it's Syrian. There's a small community which is trying to hold its own. which is also a religious minority in that region. So Abdullah Öcalan's idea of confederalism, which also argues about equality between men and women, is, when we think about it as an emancipatory ideology, we have to think about a space like India within which there are these multiple hierarchies, there are authoritarian forms of political and social rule. We have to think about the fact that Indians are not even free to marry one another, right? Indians are not free to love one another, right? There are ideas of love jihad. Two people kiss in public, they could be beaten up, right? So we're thinking about forms of control and controlled life, which regulate not only relations between men and women, but also demand that these are fixed identities and also emphasize heterosexuality, right? Emphasize marriage. The fact that if you're gay and lesbian within a community causes a huge amount of social violence to be directed against you. So in a situation like this, I think that what we need to draw upon are forms of thinking that are coming up in different parts of the world, including the Rojava commune, right? Which imagine that we have to find solutions which operate and which can be worked out in smaller community spaces, right? That's where we need to begin, right? So if we think about a place like Kerala, to think about how we can arrive at fundamental relations of equality, compassion, justice across gender, across race, across sexuality, across religion, within smaller spaces, and to think about how this can then percolate outwards. And this is an important thing to think about when you also think about the fact that it's the Srinarayana movement, for example, started off as something that was a movement among the Iravas, right? But it defined the intellectual and social landscape of Kerala thereafter. And the fact that the communist movement builds upon the legacy of the Srinarayana movement, for example. So I think this question, I mean, this is a big answer to a very specific question that you've raised. And I think what I'm trying to say here is that given the fact of the society that we live in, where we are all in some sense saying, I want to breathe, right? Like George Floyd, right? And this is something that we see in Kerala. We are a very progressive society, right? And if I may, as a Malayali chauvinist, I can say we are not like Uttar Pradesh, right? But even then, even within Kerala, there are these spaces where you cannot breathe free. So we need to draw upon these modes of thinking, which are not only about world revolution, but also about smaller forms of change, right? Which is what the Rojava, and in some sense, Abdullah Öcalan's thought is very focused. Here is a man thinking at the edge of a precipice, right? With all the powers of the world kind of bearing down on his thought. So I think it's a wonderful example to think with. And of course, you may have read Murray Bookchin. Are you familiar with it? Yes, I mean, because there is a whole genealogy there.
That's how Abdullah got into that kind of anarchist thought, I believe.
Exactly. So again, when you think about Abdullah Öcalan, it's not thinking from within a paradigm of the Middle East or Islam. He's drawing upon a now forgotten American figure, Murray Bookchin. And those are the kinds of affinities that we are trying to think about, that we have to think with the world. Right? So I'll stop there. Sorry. I don't want to go on for too long. But thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Any more questions? Ms. Bindu? Ms. Nidnu? Priya? Priya, I think, has a question. Priya? Yeah,
sir, good evening, sir.
Hi.
Sir, I'm Priya. Colg Arts College teacher. Sir, Indian ദേശീയത ഇന്ത്യയിൽ മാത്രം നിർമ്മിക്കപ്പെട്ടതല്ല എന്നുള്ള താങ്കളുടെ ഒരു പരാമർശം. അത് ജ്യോതിബ ഫുലെയിൽ തുടങ്ങി MN റോയ് ഇന്റർനാഷണൽ കമ്മ്യൂണിസ്റ്റ്, പിന്നെ ഗാന്ധിയിലെത്തി. ഗാന്ധിയുടെ 1948 അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ അവസാനത്തെ സത്യാഗ്രഹം, ജനുവരി 13 സത്യാഗ്രഹം നമ്മുടെ അന്നത്തെ ഗാന്ധിയൻ കാഴ്ചപ്പാടിന്റെ ദേശീയതയായിട്ട് കൂട്ടി വായിക്കേണ്ടതാണെന്ന് ഞാൻ വിചാരിക്കുന്നു. പിന്നെ നമ്മുടെ ഫസ്റ്റ് പ്രധാനമന്ത്രി നെഹ്റു മുന്നോട്ട് വെച്ച ഒരു ദേശീയത, അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ ഒരു ഇന്റർനാഷണൽ കാഴ്ചപ്പാട്, അന്നത്തെ വിദേശ നയം, പിന്നെ കൂടുതലായിട്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ ജനാധിപത്യ ബോധം, ഒരു വിമർശനത്തിന് അംഗീകരിക്കാൻ അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് 1957 വരെയുള്ള അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ പ്രൈം മിനിസ്റ്റർഷിപ്പ്. പക്ഷെ അന്നൊക്കെ മുന്നോട്ട് വെച്ച ഈ ഒരു ദേശീയതയും ജനാധിപത്യവും പിന്നെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മുടെ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ നിന്ന് ഇത്രമാത്രം ഇന്നിപ്പോ നമ്മൾ COVID-19 പശ്ചാത്തലത്തിൽ സാർ സൂചിപ്പിച്ചതുപോലെ അതിനൊരു പ്രസക്തി ഇല്ല എന്നുള്ള, ദേശീയതയ്ക്ക് പ്രസക്തി ഇല്ല എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴും ഇന്ത്യൻ ദേശീയത ഇപ്പോഴും ഒരു ഹിന്ദു ദേശീയത എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലേക്ക് തന്നെ വാഴ്ത്തപ്പെടുന്ന രീതിയിലേക്ക് വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് നമ്മുടെ ഒരു ചരിത്രഗതിയിൽ ഇത്ര നമ്മുടെ ഒരു ദേശീയ കാഴ്ചപ്പാടിനെ, ഇത്രയും ഒരു മൾട്ടിനാഷണലിസം എന്നുണ്ടായിരുന്ന ഒരു കാഴ്ചപ്പാടിനെ സാർ പ്രയോഗിച്ച ആ ഒരു വാക്ക് ഡീടെറിട്ടോറിയൽ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് എന്നുള്ള, അത് വളരെ പ്രസക്തമാണ്. പക്ഷെ അതിന് എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഇത്രമാത്രം മാറ്റം നമ്മൾ ഏതെങ്കിലും ഒന്നിലേക്ക് ഒതുങ്ങുന്ന രീതിയിലേക്കുള്ള നമ്മുടെ ദേശീയതനെ വളരെ വികലമായിട്ട് വായിക്കുന്ന രീതിയിൽ നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് വന്നത് എന്നുള്ളത് വലിയൊരു പ്രശ്നമാണ്. വളരെ മനോഹരമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സെഷൻ ആയിരുന്നു, വളരെ ഇൻഫോർമേറ്റീവും കൂടിയായിരുന്നു. താങ്ക് യു.
Thank you, Priya. I mean, I'll answer in English because I find it easier to talk in English, do a lecture in English. See, I think there's an important question that we have to see. If you think about the idea of the nation, right? The idea of the nation is very young, right? It's not something that has existed for like 300 years or 400 years. Think again about something like the Soviet Union, right? Which began in 1917 and ended in 1989. Now there is an entire generation that exists for whom Soviet Union might well as be the ancient Egyptian civilization or ancient Mayan civilizations. I've never heard of it. So everything that seems forever can sometimes suddenly vanish. Right? So when we think about that movement in the early 20th century, when nationalism was imagined within a world of other nations, it's important to remember what happened in India, right? So with the coming of Gandhi, with the coming back of Gandhi, there is a closure of the Indian mind that happens, right? Where we move from the 1930s towards defining Indian nationalism as something that happens within a territorial space called India. We jettison the diaspora even, right? So if you think about the 1930s, India is kind of carving itself as an entity which leaves out the Indians who are settled in Fiji, Mauritius, South Africa, all the diaspora. That's where we began. Gandhi's thought begins in South Africa. By the 1930s, South Africa is out. So an imagination that was created closes down. Nehru tries to sustain this. And as I pointed out, with the Bandung, with the non-aligned movement, but we are seeing that this is not only true of India, right? When you think about the United States, you think about Turkey, you think about Brazil, what we are having an increasing turning inwards, the evolution of authoritarian nationalism, which is turned inwards, right? And this is something that's the reaction to that larger international vision, a larger, let's say, left socialist progressive vision that existed earlier, as indigenous elites try and gain control and keep people within the shell of the nation. So in that, what we are living through is a period that too will pass, right? Just as much as internationalism is a phase that gave way to nationalism, now we are seeing a phase of authoritarian nationalism, which I think will again give way to much broader imagination. Because if you think about what's happening in the United States right now, what allows for someone like Joe Biden, a hugely compromised Democrat, right, to appear as a savior? It's only because Trump, his opponent, represents a depths to which American politics has fallen. Right? So there are these forces of reaction and opposition and the forces of progress, and I think we'll see their fluctuation. We just happen to be living at an unfortunate moment in history right now. But this too will pass. And I think what we need to understand is that, and this is a wonderful book written by this young scholar from the former Soviet Union, Anatoly Yurchak. And the title of his book is Everything Was Forever and Then It Was No More. Right? It's like in 1989, the Soviet Union appeared to have been there for, no one thought the Soviet Union would collapse, and then it was gone. And people who are doing their PhDs on the Soviet Union suddenly found that it was pretty useless, right? That entity had ceased to exist. So I think what we need to do is to have a kind of larger horizon of time within which we think. Because if we think only with the moment, we cannot see the future, right? So all of the questions that you ask are valid. where there is a movement of internationalism which is closed off. It is sustained in one sense by Nehru. But remember, even as Nehru was sustaining this vision, the Janasangh, which is going to morph into the BJP later, was arguing for a very Hindu, very nationally defined kind of politics at that time, right? Reclaiming Kashmir, all the issues that the BJP has now brought back. So nothing ever goes away. So what we have to be aware of as historians is that we need to think with multiple temporalities, that at any given time, there are these different temporalities, different politics. And if you think with one temporality, you're going to be myopic, right, in terms of understanding or creating a new politics. And so that question that Unnimaya asked earlier, which is the kind of question you should be asking, how do we think with Abdullah Öcalan, right, in India? What vision does Abdullah Öcalan give us for India's future? Right? And that's the kind of question that allows us to move outside the myopia of the moment and to think with a broader vision. But thank you for your question.
Okay, any more questions? Sir, I have a question, sir. It's about a recent development, that is May 25th, we know that George Floyd was put on chokehold. And then after that, there was this movement which was meant to vandalize the statues of slave traders, conquerors. And we also came to know that Columbus got beheaded. And wasn't that quite unfortunate that in Johannesburg, M.K. Gandhi's bronze statue was also vandalized, and the person who was part of that particular team believed that Gandhi was very much a perpetrator as far as racial discrimination was concerned. What is your take on that particular, I mean, how do you react to that, sir?
So the several sets of questions that are in your question, I think there's a sense of historical redressal that is happening with this removing the statue of Rhodes or bringing down the statue of Confederate generals, because these were all, they're not statues in some sense. They're also monuments to a particular kind of history, right? So there is a new generation, a new form of historical consciousness that is attacking these. So in that sense, I think what we're seeing here is the working out of a longer term, a longer temporality of history. That's one question. The second question is about the building of statues. Right? For me personally, I do not care much for statues. So if you put up a statue, its value is that it allows birds to come and excrete on it. Right? So these are probably perches for birds to shit on. That's what a statue for me represents. So in that sense, I'm not at all into statues. So I'm answering the conceptual part of it. This is my personal view. And when you come to Gandhi's statue and the attack on Gandhi, you must remember that Gandhi is a historical figure. Gandhi is a person who was a master political strategist. And increasingly, over the last 10 or 15 years, I've been reading Ambedkar seriously. And you begin to see the ways in which Gandhian politics was a permanent maneuvering in order to keep a certain form of hierarchy in place in India. This is what led Ambedkar at the end of his life to finally leave Hinduism, so to speak, and move towards a religion where he believed that there would be a rational approach to life, to equality, to religion, and so on. So personally, if you ask me about Gandhi, my opinion about Gandhian statues is like my opinion regarding all statues. If a statue of Gandhi is defaced or destroyed, I don't have much investment in it. It's okay. There should be no statues. But with regard to a politics that attacks Gandhi, I can perfectly understand that as well. Because in Africa, I'm located in the continent of Africa, most people are aware that Gandhi had very little affinity with black politics, right, when he was in South Africa. So I can understand the anger at Gandhian politics. But the reason why Gandhi becomes an important figure is that his idea of non-violence is in some sense taken up as a conceptual issue. Because Gandhi was Gandhian nonviolence, as Faisal Devji has argued very recently in a book, is a very violent phenomenon, right? Because Gandhian nonviolence is about persuading others to a particular form of politics, which, as we saw in the case of Ambedkar, leaves out the possibility of a fundamental transformation in Indian society. You remember what happens in 1932 in the Pune Pact. Gandhi says, I will commit a fast and I will die. And Ambedkar backs down. That is a form of violence, right? That he enacts so as to keep certain hierarchies in place. So the question of the bringing down of statues is part of a larger historical process. The question of the value of statues, I would say, worthless. The question of Gandhi in Africa, I think this is a very complicated issue. And I think in India, we still have to give up this reverence. Right? Because now what is happening is that Tridip Suhrat, who was the director of the Sabarmati Ashram, is bringing out the diaries of Manu Gandhi. You remember Gandhi in the later years of his life, 1946 onwards, and he was that period of Noakhali, that there were these experiments that Gandhi conducted with his own sexuality, where he was sleeping alongside his grandniece in the nude and so on. And these are questions that we need to think about seriously, right? It's not enough to just think about Gandhi as this figure who won us our freedom. As I say, as a political strategist, Gandhi has no parallel in the 20th century. And this I will say in an unqualified manner. But if you have to look at Gandhi as a human being and Gandhi's political philosophy, there are fundamental limitations with relation to caste, with relation to gender, with relation to religion, that we need to think about. And that is what will create that constant tension, which means that no statue of Gandhi will ever be safe.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think we can wind up. Any more questions? I think.
I have a question.
Soon as, yeah,
There's one more question, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Muhammad Shiaz.
Yes, yeah.
Hi.
So thank you very much. Yeah, it was a fantastic presentation. Great. Thanks for that. So I have two questions. Can I ask two? Am I audible?
You can ask two, you can ask three, you can ask four. I have all the time in the world.
Number one, yeah, I really enjoyed your argument that the possibility of a transnational imagination to counter the hegemonic majoritarian impulses within the Indian nationalists for the time being, right? And you also talk about the COVID changing the territorialized imagination of the people. But my question is that, sir, can we, of course, that's interesting that we need to have that kind of an imagination. But beyond that imagination, we know that the current reality of India is very complicated, very demanding. So it takes time to have a very comprehensive imagination like that. My real concern is that how do we engage the real, very difficult moment of nationalistic terrain in India now? What are the ways with which we can negotiate, engage, even resist the kind of majoritarian politics that's being played out? You talk about Hani Babu being arrested and intellectual being pressurized and sidelined. So how do we actually engage with it? Number one. Number two, your ideas on Gandhi. You know that I have, as you said, there are issues with his political philosophy. But what about the timing of his intervention? And when you negate his political philosophy, how would it really reflect in the current Indian politics, where they have already negated this man and they are celebrating the murder of that person? So how that very politically correct position will contradict the kind of movement we democratic people are bringing against the majoritarian dispensation that is in the present day India? So these are my two questions. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Was as usual very, very great. And
actually, with regard to the first question, I'm afraid I must give a rather modest answer. I'm not in India right now. The fact that I can say what I say is allowed for by the fact that is what I'm saying is not being controlled or being censored. We've just seen Prashant Bhushan being censored by the Supreme Court for 2 tweets, right? So we're thinking about a level of political censorship, which you must not forget was also there during the time of the Congress, right? In the years preceding the emergency was merely the apogee. So I would recommend all of you who, like me, suffer from a degree of amnesia about former times, to read David Selburn's book, An Eye to India, which was written just after the emergency ended, in which David Selburn, who is a British journalist, writes about the period prior to the emergency. And you look at it, and everything that is being done now under Modi was being done by the Congress at that point in time as well. This is not to say that, oh, well, it's one and the same thing. No, that's not my argument. But what I am trying to say here is that there has always been a political authoritarian streak in India, largely because India is an unequal and hierarchical society, right, where we have not had a genuine democratic politics. Nehru himself was a very populist figure in many senses. And Modi, in his own way, tries to pattern himself on that kind of popularity. There are spaces within India where we have managed to work out other forms of politics, like in Kerala, right? And there's something to say about the Malayali temperament as well, where none of us is willing to give another person respect. So, I don't think we'll have a cultic politics emerging in Kerala very soon. So this question of what are we to do at this political conjuncture, I think there are large numbers of people, large numbers of organizations, large numbers of intellectuals who are doing what they need to do in India. And it would be both immodest and hubristic on my part to comment on that. But I'll leave it there. But it's very clear to me that there is resistance in India. And resistance coming from multiple quarters, resistance that is happening in politics, in literature, in the legal sphere, and so on and so forth. Now, this question of the destruction of, Priya asked the question about statutes. And in one sense, when you think about this questioning of the legacy of Nehru and Gandhi by the current government, it's also about destruction of statues. It is a legacy of the national movement that we've been given these heroes. We're given a set of people to choose from. You can choose between Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and so on and so forth. But what are the figures going to be for a new democratic politics? And that is something that is being forged in the moment. In one sense, we will have to leave Gandhi and Nehru behind if we are to create a new politics. Right? And that's what I would like to say. And that new politics is being forged right now. So when you think about people like Harsh Mandar or Arundhati Roy or multiple tribal leaders, right? It's Janu in Kerala, they're all speaking about different forms of politics that are coming up. So for us, it is as academics and as social scientists, we have to study these new forms that are emerging instead of being invested in a politics of sentimentality and a politics of nostalgia, which only looks back to what we have lost. If we go forward with our eyes firmly fixed on the past, we're going to fall flat on if you see what I mean. Right? So it's important for us as intellectuals and as human beings and as citizens to try and understand the seeds of protest in the present. And that is what, I'm not sidestepping the question that you've asked. I'm trying to say that for me, these reconsiderations, however violent, of Gandhi and Nehru are necessary, if only to take us away from the past and to understand the present more deeply and more urgently. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, I think now we'll have the formal vote of thanks. So, Lina, would you please
ഒരു മിനിറ്റ് പ്രിയ, ഞാൻ ഒന്നും കൂടെ ചോദിച്ചോട്ടെ. സാർ, ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ ഒന്ന് ചോദിക്കാം. ഇപ്പൊ ഷിയാസ് സാർ ചോദിച്ചതിന്റെ ഒരു തുടർച്ചയായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സംശയമാണ്. രാമേന്ദ്ര ഗുഹയൊക്കെ ഇന്ത്യയിലെ ജനാധിപത്യം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് തെരഞ്ഞെടുപ്പിൽ വേണ്ടി മാത്രമുള്ള ഒരു ജനാധിപത്യമായിട്ട് ഒതുക്കപ്പെട്ടു എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലുള്ളൊരു നിരീക്ഷണങ്ങൾ നടത്തുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് ഒരു അത് നമ്മുടെ ഈ ദേശീയതയായിട്ട് കൂട്ടി വായിക്കാന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു. അതിനെങ്ങനെയാണ് സാർ നോക്കിക്കാണുന്നത്?
Actually, this is something that Ram Guha is saying, and I'm very much an admirer of Ram Guha's historical scholarship. Right? The 2 books that he's written on Gandhi and India after Gandhi and so on are very important books, I think. This was the fear that Ambedkar had, that Indian democracy would become merely a simulacra, right? Where we'd have the forms of democracy. We'd hold annual elections and nothing would change. So I would recommend that if you haven't already read his 1945 book, Ambedkar's book, What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables, right? which is originally written as What the Hindus Have Done to the Untouchables. Then he renames it What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. Now, very often people go by the title of the book. The book is not so much about Gandhi at all, right? It's a book that the second edition comes out in 1946. It's probably the most detailed analysis of how a parliamentary democracy functions, how political parties function, and how money functions, how patronage functions. So after the Government of India Act of 1935, you have the elections that are held, the ministries are formed, and this is one of the most precise analysis of the hollowness of elections, right? So he shows how the Congress had, in many instances, a minority of the votes, but they won a large number of seats. Now, this is a very familiar story, right? With the BJP winning 31% of the votes and coming to power. And he said, this is what is going to happen when you have elections. Because in the end, the party that is better organized, has better money, and is willing to exercise its authority is going to win. And he says, and it's a wonderful phrase again, to read Ambedkar is to be bowled over by the precision of his analysis and his phrases. He says when the Congress went to elections, in the provincial elections that were held, he says it is an army versus a crowd. This is exactly what is happening in India right now. When you think about the BJP and the rest of the political opposition, it is an army versus a crowd, which is why the fact that we've been reduced to the shell of a democracy, the mere elections, right? And the fact that the Congress, and even if you think about the Aam Aadmi Party, which began as a breath of fresh air, right? And who believed in administration and so on, during the time that the pogrom, the killing of the Muslims, was happening in Delhi, Aam Aadmi Party had nothing to offer because they saw themselves within the framework of elections. How do we win the next election? It's not about social conscience. It's not about the actual working of democracy. It's not about the fact that democracy should not be premised on political violence where a political party acts like an army, right? And destroys its opposition. So I think this question that Ram Guha is raising is a question that has at the very heart of the way in which Ambedkar thought about political democracy in India, and the price we are paying right now is that we did not read Ambedkar. Right? If you think about it, why is it that we've begun to read, all of us, and I include myself in this, I've begun to read Ambedkar seriously only in the last 10 or 15 years. And I'll end with one fact. What Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables, which is one of the most searing critiques of the possibility of democratic politics in India, is written in 1946. 1946, the Constituent Assembly is established. Ambedkar becomes a chairman of the Constituent Assembly and proceeds to write the Constitution. This is a very ironic movement, right? A man who's given up all faith in the possibility of parliamentary democracy then writes a constitution in which parliamentary democracy is enshrined. And once the constitution is in place, Ambedkar says, I could well burn this constitution. And then he departs to another space. Right? We do not know what might have happened after 1956 because Ambedkar unfortunately dies. Right? We don't know what further transformations would have happened in his life. But this question of parliamentary democracy being reduced to elections was there at the very moment of India's founding. But we didn't pay attention. We took it for granted. There have always been people who have not taken it for granted, which is why we have had this huge churn in Indian politics, right? Starting from 1947 to the present, the existence of Dalit politics, left politics, environmental politics, the emergence of feminist politics in the 1980s. It's been this constant questioning. And the elections have gone on. There's multiple temporalities again, right? Within Indian democracy. So this question of elections, I think, is something that this process had started under the Congress itself, but that's another whole history that will probably need one or two more talks to actually discuss. I don't want to just throw it out there as an easy proposition. But it's important to remember now for us to not look back with nostalgia, right? But to look back with a clarity that allows us to understand how we are at this conjuncture in Indian history. That is not just Modi, 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 and it's not just BJP, right? That we have to understand that there are a whole set of histories that have been put in place, a whole set of warnings that were given to us, which we did not pay heed to. And to read Ambedkar is to feel a chill run down your spine, where you think, this is exactly what is happening right now. And he foresaw this, right? He foresaw the flaws within the institutions that we had set up. As he put it very plainly, you cannot create a democratic society on an undemocratic soil, right? In one sentence, he had laid bare the possibilities for democracy in India. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay, so can we have a vote of thanks, sir? Yeah, Laina?
Hello, Priya. Actually, my connection was lost in between, so I just on my mic only.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was very much an interesting session listening to you, sir, especially in the current situation, what we are going through in India. But I've seen when you were speaking about Kerala, you said that the temperament that the people here have, but I feel that the kinds of atrocities that was committed against the Dalits in other part of India, we have seen a few instances of that, like in Calicut itself, like in one school where a Dalit student was not given admission, or a school is there where only Dalit students are there. Only the Muslim families of that area, they became ready to send students to that school. So that kind of inequalities are happening even in Kerala right now. So about which we don't see much publicity is given, or not much media attention is not given to that kind of issue. And when you look at, when you see, and when you actually watch the prime time news at 6 o'clock in the evening, when you listen to the news that we have about Kerala, one may find it very difficult to accept that this is happening in Kerala too. Some kind of unrest, some kind of like problems that is happening in the social life. I mean, it's the society rather. So that is something we all are worried about.
Yes. So am I. Yes.
Because I have seen my father used to change that channel when he finds it very difficult to listen to that kind of news. Okay. So that's happening. Some kind of unrest is there in Kerala too. Okay, let me come to the my part. I feel sorry that I could not able to show myself because of almost 10 hours of online classes for me and my children, 2 kids. So by evening, our data will be expired. Sorry for that. And I found it very interesting when you have placed that Swadeshi in a context when a new geography of political affinity that emerged during the first decade of 20th century, a kind of a transnational solidarity especially when we are speaking, when we are living in a contemporary India, when a narrow nationalism, we can see that very parallel ideas about nationalism is there. So the way you have explained how the deep biological trench which separates an Indian from an Indian. So that is still there, I think, because we have seen it is not alone in the academia or not alone the people among the intellectual group. I think it is even that bothers the very normal people, the common people, how they are also worried about this kind of politics that have seen, especially the older generation. I have seen them. And the kind of insecurity that I have seen that started developing in the minds of that also at times worries a lot, because when we were in the childhood, when we were together, when we played, there was not that kind of an insecurity I have seen. But in the past few years, we could see that it's creating a kind of a problem. They are also not mentally, they find it difficult to accept. Many times they are in India, like that thing. So it is a right time to think about our nationalism. And I feel that the way you have said in the last sentence that we should look back to our history, not with nostalgia, but with some kind of a clarity. I really thank you for that kind of an idea. And when you said that equality of one person is equality for all, let us be that our mantra. And thank you for giving such a wonderful session to us. And I thank my friends Priya from Government Arts and Science College, Minzinda, and Unnimaya, our former student, and Mohammed Shiaz for making it a truly wonderful session. Because any academic session becomes more productive when it becomes interactive, and they made it truly an interactive session. And thank you so much, again, and everyone who are present here for almost 2 hours, and we patiently listening to you, and for making this webinar a truly successful one. And during this pandemic session, what I've seen that daily we get a lot of opportunity to listen to scholars around the world, and that way it is productive. And let it be an opportunity to have that kind of a transnational solidarity once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now I must go and have some chaya and peripuada.
Okay, thanks a lot. So my question about the statue was not because of any particular affinity to Gandhi, but because I'm an artist by passion and also an art lover. And thank you for joining us. So let us hope that we would have a broader sense of nationalism rather than the authoritarian nationalism that we have now. And we definitely had discussed in the department that in future we would like to have you as a patron saint, though you do not agree to the concept of cult, because you are so cordial.
No, I don't mind the cult devoted to myself. I'm okay with that. Go ahead.
Okay, so the thing is that coronavirus seems to be unappeasable, and we've transited to the virtual. But once normalcy is restored, we definitely would conduct an international seminar, and we would like you to be there as resource person, sir. So with that note, with everyone's permission, let me wind up. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.